Chapter 8, Memory Part 2. In the second video, it's going to be quite a bit shorter than the first. I'm talking about encoding, how the information that comes into the sensory and into short-term memory is processed into a neurological code that the brain can understand, right? So we're going to be talking about different characteristics of encoding, effortful and automatic processing, levels of processing, exposure and rehearsal, organization and imagery, and prior knowledge shaping encoding. So effortful and automatic processing. As we talked about in the last video, the better we code the information, the more effectively we can retrieve it later when needed. So effortful processing, this is initiated intentionally. It requires conscious attention. This is about you rehearsing, like repeating, adding meaning to the information, making notes, possibly creating charts, anything that you do for studying for this course. It's effortful processing. Automatic processing, it's completely unintentional. It requires minimal attention. So, for example, saying, what did you do yesterday? Well, yesterday I was here and I was here and I was, whatever. I went to Costco and whatnot. I remember what I did yesterday. I didn't purposely do anything. It's just sort of automatically processed. The sequence of events, where you were, things like that. Okay, B, levels of processing. This is where we're going to talk about how well you encode this information. Okay, so the more deeply we encode, the better we're going to recall. There's three types of encoding. There's structural, there's phonemic, and semantic. In this graph, what it shows is the depth of encoding, like how effective it is. So as you can see, structural is the most shallow, phonemic is deeper. The person was able to correctly remember, the object 65% of the time. And then you'll see that semantic, which means giving meaning to something, that resulted in the participant recognizing the object almost 90% of the time after. So let's just go over this. So for example, the word potato, it's in capitals. You're just memorizing potato, capitals. That's pretty shallow, right? So that's structural, how it looks. Phonemic is how it sounds, and then judge if it matches. So they were given the word horse, rhymes with course. So you have the word horse, and then you have to mentally say, does that rhyme with course? That's giving it horse course. That's giving it more meaning, right? And attending to the sound. So that's a slightly deeper method of encoding. And then the most deep, the semantic, was where you're attending to the meaning of things. So the word was table. They had to remember. Okay, and the question is, does it fit into this sentence? The man peeled the, so you have to think table. The man peeled the table. That doesn't make any sense, right? So the answer is no. So when they had to remember the word table, because they had encoded it with the most meaning, that resulted in 90% recognition of the word. Basically, this study showed that the depth of processing increased later recognition of the words when they saw them in a larger list. C, exposure and rehearsal. Exposure is, the repeated exposure is rote repetition of information. Okay, so it is not an optimal method. It's like if you're going to be studying for like the test 2 that's coming up, or however you studied for test 1 or any other test, if you're simply reading the text over and over and over, that is not an effective way of studying. That is repeated exposure. It is the least optimal method of encoding the information. Exposure, the repeated, it's okay for keeping information in working memory, like if you're trying to remember a phone number or somebody's name for just a few seconds. It's okay for that, but absolutely not for long-term transfer. Elaborative focuses on the information's meaning, just like we talked about in the last slide, right? And focusing on meaning facilitates later recall. So what you're doing is you organize the information that has meaning for us. It serves as a scheme. The scheme serves as a cue for later retrieval. There's different things that you can do to give meaning to information. Understanding it. For example, in the first video, we talked about primacy and recency effects. Do you remember what they were? If you just memorized primacy effect equals this, recency effect equals this. If you just memorize the words, you're not going to retrieve it well on the test. Or if you continue in psychology, 2 years later, you'll be Googling what primacy and recency effect is. If you understand it, and you paid attention to the example of when I said, information at the beginning of the lecture and information at the end of the lecture and why that is, and you understood it, you should be able to retrieve that much better for the test, right? You can also apply it to one's life, like applying it to the slides, right? Applying it to lectures that you do in school. If you play soccer, for example, and your coach, maybe your coach gives lectures sometimes and you remember the stuff they first start saying and then blah, blah, blah. That's the U shape, and then it comes up and you're going to remember the last thing they said probably. So apply it to your life and you can remember it that way. Relating to already learned concepts, using imagery, you can visualize what that effect looks like and why. You can use mnemonic devices or just basically anything that requires deeper processing. Okay, the next section, organization and imagery. So here they talk about hierarchy and chunking. Hierarchy is, so memory is enhanced by associations between concepts. Okay, so enhances understanding of how elements are related. And I've got a diagram in the next slide to show you that. Chunking, we've talked about many times, combining items into larger units of meaning, easier to keep active in short-term memory. So you can see there which list do you think is easier to remember? There's no way I'd remember that first list. Absolutely not. The second one, breaking it into chunks like that, makes it significantly easier to remember. So here's a study they talked about in the text. Participants presented with meaningful hierarchy, they remembered more than 3 times as many words. So taking the chapter once again, kind of creating a visual map, right? You've got a hierarchy, you've got encoding, automatic processing versus effort for processing. Now going into the test, if you can sort of visually memorize this, you're going to remember automatic processing. There really wasn't much said about that after that point. Whereas effortful processing, we talked about elaborate rehearsal, and we talked about maintenance rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal was a simple repeating of things over and over again, and it resulted in shallower processing. Whereas elaborate rehearsal results in deeper processing, and we spent more time on that. We talked about how you can link it to your life and existing knowledge. We can talk about um, putting meaning to the information, how you organize the information, maybe images, visual things, um, ways of remembering the information. Okay, so basically, what this graph shows is that the percentage of items recalled, if it was a random hierarchy, is 20%. But if you put things into a meaningful hierarchy, such as this, all of a sudden recall jumps to, what is that, like 68%. Words presented in a logically organized hierarchical structure are remembered better than the same words placed in a random, in a similar looking structure. So organization and imagery continued. They talk about mnemonic devices, any type of memory aid like hierarchies, the chunking, acronyms. So these devices, they don't reduce the information, they just reorganize it into meaningful units and provide extra cues to help retrieve it from long-term memory. Memory is enhanced if we use both verbal and visual cues. So the more, codes, the more senses that you use while encoding, the better encoded it is and the higher the retrieval rate. So if you're studying, you're reading it with your eyes, you're taking notes with your, hand, and if you can be verbally saying it at the same time, that's 3 sensories, and that's going to result in better encoding. Visual imagery. Memory is enhanced if you use both verbal and visual, as we just said. This is easier with concrete objects than abstract objects. I would remember that. For example, visualize fire truck. Okay, now visualize jealousy, or love, or confidence, or any sort of abstract concept. That's going to be harder to do, but with concrete objects, it works quite well. Dual coding theory. Information stored in 2 forms. Okay, verbal codes and nonverbal codes. Sorry if that was unclear. So dual coding theory is just what we've been talking about. Dual, meaning 2, coding. 2 ways of coding is going to enhance memory, enhance encoding, and enhance retrieval. Method of loci. Using imaginary physical environment and places of images in order to remember. There's a video there's several videos on YouTube which sort of explain this, but they're a little bit long, and so I'll just say, so one example, hundreds of years ago when they were on this, there was a big assembly and hundreds of people inside, and there was an earthquake and the ceiling crashed down and killed lots of people. Okay, so the police show up and they were talking to this gentleman who had been inside, and they were saying, okay, so what are the names of the people in there? We need to identify the bodies. And apparently he was able to remember the names of people based on where they were sitting and what tables they were sitting in. So he could remember their names based on their physical location inside the building. That's where this method of loci comes up. It's anything to do with tying locations in space or locations in a physical environment in order to increase your memory, in order to better encode the information that's coming in. So for visual imagery, I think if you remember dual coding theory, dual, 2, that's easy. And method of loci is for location. Okay, remembering or imagining physical locations and remembering and encoding that way. The last section, prior knowledge shaping encoding. In this section, we're talking about mental representations or schemas. Okay, and they are based on prior knowledge, prior experiences that you've had, and how these mental representations and schemas affect the way that we remember things. So we don't remember every word or every event. So when you hear a story or you see a movie or you read a book, you don't remember every single word that was there. Usually you remember the general meaning, the general gist of what happened, right? We form a mental representation that captures the essential meaning or gist of the event. So a schema is a mental framework. It's an organized pattern of thought. It's not just one thought, it's an organized pattern of many thoughts. Okay? We form schemas through experience, and they can strongly influence the way we encode material in memory. For example, you have a schema for washing clothes, right? So a schema is a pattern of thought, pattern of events. So washing clothes, throw it in the washing machine, you dump in the liquid, and you put the lid down, and you press the button. It's a series of events of what washing clothes mean. Same with taking baths, same with everything, right? And what we do is we create perceptual sets. They help to organize and interpret information in a certain way. So perceptual sets, schemas, mental framework, the same thing, right? They use those terms interchangeably in the text. Next, they talk about an experiment about expert knowledge. Okay, so how do schemas and mental frameworks, what impact or how do they work with acquiring expert knowledge? So acquiring expert knowledge can be viewed as a process of developing schemas, mental frameworks that help to encode information into meaningful patterns. So if someone has schemas or mental framework and meaningful patterns, say for how soccer works, soccer plays, I always use soccer, say, or music, right? If they already have all of these developed schemas for how the music works and how things go, and you see somebody talking about soccer or football or any other sport, and they have all these ideas about plays and set plays and the way things work, and then someone who is watching it for the first time and you're just like, what the heck are they talking about, right? They have all these organized mental representations of certain plays and the way things should be. So they're able to watch the game in an entirely different way, I think, right? And here's an example they talked about in the text. This one had to do with chess pieces. So you've got a group of people who are experts in chess, and you've got a group of people who are new, novices, right? So they had a blank board, and they put the chess pieces on the board. The first time, they put the chess pieces on a board in a way that would be strategic in chess, something that makes sense, okay, in a logical play. They put them on the board like that, then they took them off, and then they told the experts put the pieces back on, and they told the novices put the pieces back on. Now you can see in this, in the logical plays, the experts were able to recall 22 elements, and the people who did not have these schemas, who did not have these mental representations of chess moves in their heads, could only do 6. So then you take all the pieces off the board, and then the experimenters, they put all the pieces in an illogical way, a random way on the board. So the experts were not able to use their schema of plays, their mental representation of how things should work. And when they did that, the experts put the pieces back pretty much in the same random way that the novices did. This experiment sort of provides support for how schemas work and how they result in better encoding, or how information is more readily encoded when somebody has a well-developed schema. Okay, that's it. So in the second video, we talked about encoding and how information is encoded into long-term memory. We talked about effortful and automatic processing, levels of processing, exposure and rehearsal, organization and imagery, and prior knowledge and how prior knowledge shapes and encodes. Okay, so the next sections, storage, retaining information, retrieval, accessing information, forgetting, memory as a constructive process, and the biology of memory. They're shorter sections, so I'm going to leave those for you to do. If you have any questions at all, please do email me at lhogart3@uwo.ca, which is on the OWL website. And I will see you in the next video in chapter 9.